trench warfare was not a new idea to war. It had been first seen in the United States Civil War. From then on, the idea was practiced all over the globe. The trenches have been used in many civil wars after the United States Civil War. Since the trenches were so long and covered many miles, the trenches had to be made differently depending on the topography of the area. Sometimes the trench location had rocky terrain, so the trenches had to be made out of sandbags. Besides rocky terrain, the trenches were usually in the ground. In the very beginning of the war, the Allies brought 140,000 Chinese laborers to build the trenches. 40,000 Chinese laborers went to work for the French, and 100,000 went to work for the British. This was the biggest amount of work that the Chinese did in World War I. The trenches were 400 miles long in diameter. They stretched from Switzerland to the North Sea. The length of the trenches is 25,000 miles long due to the winding turns of the trenches. In between the two sides, there was a thing called no man's land. In no man's land, there were few inhabitants, and the towns were completely ruined due to fighting. As well as the length of the trenches, the British were in charge of what came through the North Sea. They let only their own battleships and harmless boats through, such as fishing boats. The British sunk every ship that seemed suspicious to them. The trenches were well equipped and thought out. In front were the outposts. In the outposts, soldiers would sit in little holes with binoculars and watch the enemy lines. If they saw any movement or if they sensed an attack, the soldier would send a telegram back to the headquarters. This was important because it allowed either side to see when the next attack or raid was going to come. Behind the outposts, there would be a few miles of barbed wire. Barbed wire was a relatively new tactic in war. A man named Joseph Glidden in Illinois invented barbed wire in the 1880s by twisting two wires together and letting their ends stick out. Many soldiers said that every time they looked at the wire, they could always see a few dead bodies. Every night, men were randomly selected to be a part of a wiring group called the wiring party. The job that these men had to do was to go out into no man's land during the night and replace the barbed wire that was destroyed, and they would also put in new wire. This job was really risky, and many men were killed in the process of doing this. Behind the barbed wire were the front lines. The front lines were where the majority of the soldiers were in the trenches. These trenches were usually about 8 feet deep and 4 to 6 feet wide. Since many men spent their time in the front lines, there were many dead men there. This was the reason why the trenches were 8 feet deep. If a soldier was killed, he would be placed under a wooden slab, under where the soldiers walked. Only after about a week would the men even consider bringing the dead bodies to the back of the trenches. Behind the front lines were the front line supports. In the front line supports, there would be a large amount of extra ammunition that would be given to soldiers multiple times a day. As well as extra ammunition, in the front line supports, there was a man that manned a telephone that would connect to the headquarters in case the trench ran out of supplies. The front line supports were usually buried underground so that their ammunition and people manning the telephone could not be tampered or damaged. Behind this was the first support trench. This was the trench that was used as a medical bay for wounded soldiers. Behind that was the final artillery line. This is where the machine guns and mortars were. The machine guns and mortars were said to have been able to cover the whole of the barbed wire. Behind the artillery lines were the large supplies of extra ammunitions, and railroad tracks that would bring supplies to different trenches. Connecting all of the trenches were trenches called communication trenches, and, by the title, they were used to communicate information to various lines of the trenches. A soldier's schedule was very difficult. A soldier would spend 4 days on active duty, then 4 days in close standby, and then 4 days of rest. While a soldier was on active duty, he would go without sleep for 4 days and fight the whole time. While a soldier was in close standby, he would be getting soldiers more ammunition and bringing them food. When a soldier had 4 days of rest, they would usually go and sleep for all the 4 days, due to the lack of sleep for the last 8 days. Some recurring problems that the soldiers usually faced were from weather and from boredom. Many days, there was a lot of rain, and this led to the trenches becoming muddy and making the walls wet and making the walls cave in. Living in the trenches was very bad because there were many dead people and rotting food lying around. One of the main causes of death in World War I was disease, and this was because of the rotting bodies in the trenches. During a war, soldiers were not able to take the dead bodies to the medics because they were meant to stay in the front lines. Trench warfare finally ended when the Allies made a breakthrough and were able to ambush the enemies. This happened in late July 1918.